He always believed their love was strong and their marriage honest. But in the last moments of her life, his wife confessed what she had been hiding for him all her long. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The year was 1955. In a world divided by color, the United States still clung tightly to the chains of racial segregation. Jim Crow laws dictated where a black man could walk, eat, sit, even look. Interracial relationships weren't just frowned upon, they were dangerous. A black man caught in the wrong place with a white woman could be beaten, imprisoned, or worse. The South enforced these unspoken rules with particular cruelty. The North, though less brutal, was no haven either. Oliver Bryant had learned these lessons young. Born into poverty in a small southern town, he had spent his childhood watching men like his father struggle under a system built to keep them down, his father a factory worker, his mother a tired woman who spent more hours scrubbing white people's floors than tending her own home. Oliver had worked since he could walk, fixing cars alongside his uncles, learning the way engines breathed and groaned under the weight of labor. By 18, he was a full mechanic at a small auto shop, one of the few jobs where a black man could earn an honest living without answering to a white boss face to face. He was tall and lean, his skin dark as polished mahogany, carrying a quiet confidence that unnerved white men and intrigued white women, in equal measure a dangerous combination in the world he lived in. But Oliver had never been foolish enough to court that danger. He'd seen what happened to black boys who let their eyes linger too long on white skin. That was until Sarah Whitmore. Sarah had never known poverty. Born into a prominent white family, she'd spent her childhood in silk dresses and expensive shoes. Her days shaped by etiquette lessons and social events designed to mold her into the perfect Southern wife. Her father, Charles Whitmore, was a man of considerable influence, a businessman whose wealth came not just from investment, but from the power he held over other people. He believed in bloodlines, in purity, and the natural superiority of those who shared his complexion. Sarah had never felt at home in his world. She'd grown up suffocating under expectations she had no wish to meet quiet, obedient, demure. Instead, she was curious, restless, always reaching for something beyond the perfect life laid out in front of her. The night she met Oliver, she was 18 years old. The summer heat clung to her skin as she slipped into a dress her mother had called too bold, too revealing. The air smelled of whiskey and cigarette smoke as she stepped into a dimly lit basement where the music of rebellion played jazz, smooth and electric, its notes curling around the edges of segregation like a whisper of defiance. The party was one of the few places in town where the color line blurred. Young people, black, white, and everything between, gathered in secret, sharing drinks and laughter and glances that could never be exchanged in daylight. It was there Oliver first saw her. She was nothing like the white woman he'd been warned about. There was no fear in her eyes when she met his gaze, no hesitation in the way she crossed the room toward him. Her blonde hair fell loose over her shoulders. Her blue eyes were alight with something dangerous: curiosity, excitement, defiance. She asked his name. He hesitated. She smiled, and suddenly he found himself answering, his voice low and careful, as if testing the air between them. They talked for hours, words slipping easily into the space between them. She was fascinated by the world he came from, by the way he spoke, the way he thought. He was wary but drawn in by her boldness, by how untouched she seemed by the fear that governed his every move. It was intoxicating. It was foolish. It was, somehow, inevitable when the night ended. She told him she wanted to see him again. He knew he should walk away. He didn't. The first time her father saw them together, it was an accident. Oliver had been working late at the shop when Sarah appeared at the edge of the garage, her pale skin lit by the glow of a street lamp. His heart clenched, his pulse hammered in his ears. She shouldn't be there, it wasn't safe. Before he could usher her away, A black car pulled to the curb, and Charles Whitmore stepped out. The world seemed to stop. Oliver watched realization dawn in the man's eyes, watched his face twist with a kind of fury only a white man in that place and time felt entitled to show. Sarah tried to speak, but her father silenced her with a glare cold enough to freeze the summer air. Without another word, he seized her arm and dragged her away. Oliver didn't move. He knew better than to follow. The next morning, he found a note slipped under the garage door. "Stay away from my daughter." It wasn't a warning. It was a threat. For the first time in his life, Oliver realized he wasn't afraid of men like Charles Whitmore. He was afraid of what he was willing to risk for Sarah. The weeks that followed were hell for her, forbidden to leave the house, every move watched, every phone call monitored. Her father refused to speak to her, as though acknowledging her existence might taint him. Her mother said nothing at all, only watched with unreadable eyes. Sarah fought as best she could, argued, screamed, begged, but her father's will was law in that house, and there was no court in the state that would side with a daughter who defied the man who owned her world. And yet she found a way. A letter slipped into a delivery boy's pocket, a whisper in the ear of a maid who'd once known love that crossed the same lines. A meeting late at night while the house slept. She found Oliver again and told him what he already knew: her father would never let them be together. She had made her choice anyway. She had chosen him. It was reckless. It was dangerous. A white woman running off with a black man wasn't just scandal in that place. It was treated as crime. There would be no mercy, no forgiveness, no understanding. But love has never much cared for laws. So in the dead of night, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and whatever nerve they had left, they ran from her father's power, from a world that would never accept them, toward a future with no guarantees, no promises, no safety. Only the hope that together they could build something of their own. They had no idea the real danger had only just begun. The night air was thick with the weight of the decision. Sarah's hands trembled around the small suitcase she'd packed in secret address, a few coins, a photograph of her mother she wasn't even sure why she'd taken. It was almost absurd how little of her life fit inside it. Her home, her name, her entire status, all of it, she was leaving behind. Oliver waited for her beneath the shadows of the abandoned train station at the edge of town. He carried no suitcase, no photographs. His whole life had always been light enough to carry with him. When she saw him, she wanted to run and throw herself into his arms, but she held herself steady. There was no room for softness tonight. They had one chance to disappear. The train that would carry them north was due within the hour, a freight train bound for a factory town in Illinois, where mixed-race couples were rare but not against the law. It was the best option they had. Sarah glanced back once, half expecting to see her father's men storming toward her. The street stayed empty. The fear lingered anyway. Oliver took her hand, rough, calloused, steady. "Are you sure?" His voice was quiet but firm. Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded. They climbed aboard and hid themselves among crates and sacks of grain. No one saw them leave. No one knew where they'd gone. For the first time in her life, Sarah was free. The journey was long and grueling, traveled in darkness, their bodies stiff from crouching in the narrow gaps between cargo. Every clank of the wheels was a reminder there was no turning back. Oliver barely spoke, always listening, always watching, tensing at every stop for the sound of footsteps, for the doors to slide open on men with guns. No one ever came. On the second night, they reached Illinois. The factory town was nothing like the elegant streets of Sarah's childhood, the air thick with smoke, the buildings soot-stained, the people worn down by long hours of labor. But here, they were just another couple. No one looked twice at a white woman standing beside a black man. It wasn't acceptance. It was indifference. And indifference for the first time in either of their lives was enough. They found a room in a cramped boarding house where the walls were thin and privacy was nearly non-existent, barely enough space for the narrow bed they shared. But it was theirs. Oliver took a job at the local steel mill, 12-hour shifts in unbearable heat. Sarah found work as a seamstress, her fingers blistering from long days of stitching. It was hard and grinding, and nothing like the life she'd known. She never complained. For the first time, this was a life she'd chosen. They married in a tiny church on the outskirts of town, no guests, no flowers, no music. Just the two of them and a preacher who barely looked up as he muttered the vows. No ring, no celebration, only a quiet exchange of promises spoken not for the world, but for each other. When it was over, Sarah stood outside the church staring up at the sky, feeling the weight of the moment settle into her chest. She was no longer Sarah Whitmore, daughter of privilege. She was Sarah Bryant, wife of a black man, in a world that would never fully accept either of them. And still, she felt lighter than she ever had in her life. The first year tested them both. The factory town was safer than the South, but safer wasn't the same as kind. Oliver's co-workers kept their distance, unsure what to make of a man who'd arrived with a white wife. The women of the town eyed Sarah warily, as if she might be lost or confused, or simply out of her mind. They were tolerated. They were never welcomed. Money stayed tight some nights. They went to bed hungry. Sarah learned to mend clothing until it was more stitch than fabric. Oliver learned to stretch a dollar further than it wanted to go, bargaining for scraps at the market, working extra shifts until his whole body ached. They endured, because love had carried them this far. But love didn't erase fear. Sarah's father hadn't forgotten her. Letters began arriving at the boarding house, each one colder than the last. The first was a demand, come home down. The second, a warning, you don't understand what you've done. The third, a threat, plain and simple, you will regret this. Sarah burned every one. The fear stayed anyway. Her father wasn't a man who accepted defeat, and she had no way of knowing what he'd do the day he finally found her. The fear crept into her dreams. It whispered at the market when men in suits looked at her a beat too long. It followed her home at night, in footsteps that might have been nothing at all. Without telling Oliver, she began setting money aside, a few coins under the mattress at first, then a few bills sewn into the hem of a dress. She told herself it was only caution, a habit born of fear rather than doubt. But somewhere underneath, she knew the truth. She had chosen Oliver. And some small, frightened part of her still believed that one day she might have to leave him behind. The years settled into a pattern. Never easy, never entirely comfortable, but theirs. Oliver worked himself to the bone and came home every night with aching muscles and soot-stained hands. Sarah stitched until her once soft hands grew rough with calluses. Piece by fragile piece, they built a life. And then their first child came. Sarah had never been more terrified. She'd expected joy, had imagined the moment she'd place her newborn in Oliver's arms and feel their family take shape. Instead, looking down at the small boy wrapped in blankets, she felt something else entirely. Guilt. Because looking at her son, she couldn't stop thinking of the child she'd already given away. She had been 17, a different girl in a different life. Her family had kept the pregnancy hidden behind closed doors, telling friends and relatives she'd taken ill and needed rest. She'd never been given a choice. When the baby came, a boy just like this one, she'd barely been allowed to hold him before he was taken from her. Her father had arranged everything, a quiet adoption, a discreet payment to ensure no records. No trace back to the Whitmore name. She had cried for weeks afterward. In time, she'd taught herself to silence the ache, told herself it was for the best, that the child would have a better life without the burden of scandal attached to his name. Then, she'd met Oliver and buried that whole chapter beneath something new. But holding her newborn son now, the past clawed its way back up. She had another child out there, a son lost before he'd ever had the chance to know her. She never told Oliver. She couldn't. The secret settled into her bones and stayed there, a quiet, gnawing thing that never fully let go. They named their son Isaac. He grew fast, his skin a rich blend of both his parents' colors, his eyes sharp like his father's, his smile soft like his mother's, the first thing the two of them had ever truly built together. And still, some part of Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. She dreamed of the boy she'd given away, wondered if he had her nose or Oliver's no that made no sense, and the thought caught her off guard every time it surfaced. The two lives tangling together in her mind in ways they shouldn't. She wondered if he ever thought of the mother he'd never known. She never spoke of it. She buried it deeper instead and devoted herself entirely to Isaac, to Oliver, to the life in front of her. But the past has a way of finding its way back even when you try to outrun it. A few years later, another child came, Margaret, wild from the very start, loud and unafraid, her laughter filling every corner of their small rooms. She had none of her mother's softness and none of her father's quiet. She was a small storm of her own making. Sarah adored her completely. But with every passing year, the secret only grew heavier. She pictured the boy, now a young man somewhere, in a house that might look something like theirs, wondering who he was. She prayed he'd been given a good life. She prayed he'd never felt abandoned. And she prayed, more than anything, that Oliver would never find out. But secrets have a way of poisoning everything they touch. Sarah grew quieter, more distant. At first, Oliver put it down to exhaustion. Parenthood was hard, and her life had never been an easy one. But then he began to notice the way she'd drift off mid-conversation, lost somewhere he couldn't follow. The way she hesitated before answering the simplest questions about her past. The way she flinched every time at the word adoption, even said in passing about someone else entirely. Oliver wasn't a man who pried. He respected silence, understood that some wounds ran too deep to touch. But this felt different. This was his wife, and she was slipping away from him in small pieces. One night, long after the children were asleep, he found her sitting at their small kitchen table, staring down at a torn scrap of fabric in her lap, not noticing him at all. For the first time in their marriage, Oliver felt a distance between them that frightened him. There were things she wasn't telling him, things he suspected she never would. And for the first time, he wondered if he really knew his wife at all. Sarah had always known marriage wasn't the fairy tale the books made it out to be, that love and survival were often two entirely separate things. She had never expected to build a marriage out of both at once. Oliver was a good husband, steady, patient, reliable, working himself raw to provide for her and the children without ever once complaining about the 12-hour shifts at the mill. He loved her. She never doubted that. But she carried something heavier than any love could lighten. Because the truth was, she hadn't married him out of love, not at first. She'd married him out of fear. She'd grown up knowing her father would choose her husband for her. That was simply how it was done in families like hers. Old Southern money with bloodlines tracing back to colonial wealth. Women in that world didn't choose. They were chosen. Her father had spent years grooming her for exactly that, introducing her to the sons of bankers and lawyers, lining them up like racehorses, inspecting each one for pedigree and wealth and the right pitch of arrogance. She had played along, smiled, nodded, and let them lead her across ballroom floors until she'd seen something entirely different, a man who didn't belong anywhere in her world, who made her question everything she'd been raised to believe. She had run to him not because she loved him yet, but because she was terrified of what her life would become if she didn't. That realization sickened her now, because all these years later, she did love him completely. She loved the way he kissed her forehead every morning before work, the way he rocked their children to sleep humming low and deep as the ground itself, the way he never once raised his voice even angry, the way he made her feel safe in a world that had never made room for people like them. And yet she had never told him the truth, that when she'd married him, it had been a choice made out of survival, not out of the heart. She told herself it didn't matter that love had arrived in time, that it made no difference how the story began so long as it had carried them here. But then came the whispers, not from Oliver, from everywhere else, from women at the market who looked at her like she'd lost her mind, from men who sneered as Oliver passed on the sidewalk, from her own children who asked questions she never knew how to answer. Mama, why do some people look at Daddy like he doesn't belong? Mama, why do the other kids say I'm different? Mama, why doesn't Grandpa ever visit? She had no answers, because the truth was ugly. She'd spent so many years trying to forget where she'd come from that she'd never once considered what it would mean for her children to grow up caught between two worlds. And worse, she'd never told Oliver any of it. Never told him that in those first, hardest months, exhausted and afraid, she had thought about leaving. That she'd counted the hidden money over and over in the quiet hours of the night, wondering if it would be enough to take the children and disappear. She never planned to do it. But the fact that she'd considered it at all had haunted her ever since. Oliver wasn't a fool. He saw how she avoided certain questions, how she went quiet whenever their children raised the subject of race, of belonging, of everything that set their family apart from every other one on the street. He began to wonder not just about her secrets, but about her love. Had she chosen him, or had he simply been her only way out? It was a question he was afraid to ask, because he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Sarah had convinced herself the past was behind her, that she'd built something new, something safe, even if modest. The world outside their door still eyed them with suspicion, but inside those walls they'd found something close to peace. Peace, though, is fragile, and the past has a habit of returning exactly when you've stopped watching for it. The next letter arrived on an ordinary afternoon, slipped beneath the door while she was out at the market, a thin white envelope on the wooden floor, like something out of another life. She stared at it a long while before opening it. No return address, just her name in handwriting she knew instantly. Her father's. The words inside were short and cold. I have not forgotten what you took from this family. Her stomach twisted. It had been years since she'd last heard from him after the demands, after the threats. There had simply been silence, and she'd let herself believe that meant he'd given up. She had been wrong. For weeks, she waited for a follow-up that never came. She tried to push it out of her mind, but the weight of it sat in her chest like a stone. What did he mean? Was this only another attempt at control, or something worse? Then she saw the man. Early evening, at the market, the children chasing each other between the stalls while she bartered over potatoes and milk. A white man in a suit standing at the corner, buying nothing, speaking to no one. Watching her. A chill ran through her. She told herself she was imagining it. The next day, she saw him again, and the day after. Always at a distance, always watching. She said nothing to Oliver. She already knew what he'd say. You're imagining things. Or worse, if it's your father, we need to face him. She didn't want to face him. She wanted him to stay exactly where she'd left him in the past. Then the second letter came, and this one wasn't from her father at all. I know who you are. Her heart stopped. She read it again. The handwriting was unfamiliar. The message vague, but she understood immediately. Someone had found out about her first child. About the son she'd given away years before anyone in this town had ever known her name. a secret buried so deep she'd nearly convinced herself it had never happened. And now, somehow, someone knew. She felt the walls of the life she'd built begin to crack. For days she said almost nothing, barely slept, barely ate. Oliver asked what was wrong. She told him it was nothing. He didn't believe her. And when he found the letter, crumpled at the bottom of her dresser drawer, she watched something shift behind his eyes, the dawning realization that there were things about his own wife he had never known, and might never fully understand. Sarah had always known the past would come for her eventually. She had spent years telling herself the life she'd built was separate from the one she'd left, that the frightened girl who hadn't fought for her first child, the bride who'd run to Oliver out of desperation rather than love, had simply ceased to exist. But that woman had only been waiting, tucked into some quiet corner of her, for the moment she'd finally have to answer for everything. That moment arrived through her body. It started slowly, a cough, a dizzy spell, nothing she took seriously at first. Then came a sharp, relentless ache in her chest that stole her breath and made even simple movement unbearable. Oliver noticed before she'd admit it the way she struggled with the iron pot on the stove, the way she winced when she thought no one was watching. He said nothing, until the night she collapsed while folding laundry, and there was nothing left to ignore. The doctor came the next morning, a white man, middle-aged, his face carefully unreadable as he pressed 2 fingers to her wrist, listening for her pulse. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm to calm, the particular calm of a man softening bad news before he delivers it. Her heart was failing. There was nothing to be done. Oliver stood frozen, hands clenched at his sides. Sarah closed her eyes and felt no fear, only exhaustion. She had spent so many years running. Perhaps it was time to stop. Oliver refused to accept it, chasing other doctors, other opinions, anything but the answer they'd already been given. It was always the same. Her time was running out. And she knew, more clearly than she'd known anything in years, that she couldn't leave this world still carrying every secret inside it. One evening, as the sun dropped low behind the rooftops, she asked Oliver to sit with her. Something in her voice sounded final, and he was afraid not of her dying, but of whatever she was about to say. She told him everything, about the money hidden away since their earliest, hardest months, about the son she'd given up before they'd ever met, about her father, and the power he still held over her even from a distance. And finally, the hardest truth of all, that she hadn't married him for love, not at the start. That he had been her escape, before he had ever been her choice. Oliver sat in silence. She couldn't read anything in his face, couldn't tell if what she saw there was anger or grief or nothing at all. Tears slipped down her cheeks as a lifetime's guilt finally came loose from her chest. And then she told him the one thing she knew, without question, to be true, that despite the lies, she had come to love him completely, more deeply than she'd ever believed herself capable of. She loved him. She hoped that would be enough. The days blurred together after that. Oliver said little. He cared for her, held her through the worst of the pain, wiped the fever from her forehead, carried her to bed when her legs could no longer hold her. He never told her how her confession had landed. She never asked. She didn't need to. He was still there. For her, in the end, that was enough. One night, as the cold settled into the house and the weight of her own body became too much to bear, she felt his arms come around her. He whispered something so quiet she barely caught it. And as she closed her eyes for the last time, she smiled, believing in that final moment that he had forgiven her. Maybe he hadn't. Maybe it didn't matter anymore. Maybe love was never really about being perfect. Maybe it was only ever about choosing to stay, even when it hurt, even when the past could never be undone, even when goodbye was the only thing left to say. The house was too quiet after that, the kind of quiet that settles into the walls themselves, into the space between breaths, into the weight of a bed that would never be shared again. Sarah was gone, and Oliver sat in the silence of their room, staring at the empty space beside him, at the pillow that still somehow held the faint shape of her head. For days he couldn't bring himself to move it, as if leaving it untouched might trick him into believing she was only somewhere else in the house. Her confession had broken something in him. Not because she had lied, but because he had never once suspected it. Through every year of their marriage, every moment they'd shared, he had believed, without question, that their love was real, built on trust, not necessity. Now he wasn't sure what to believe. Had their whole life together been something else entirely? Had she ever truly chosen him, or had he only ever been a way out of a life she didn't want? He had spent his whole life fighting to be seen as a man in a world that insisted he was less. And now, even here, even in the arms of the woman he'd loved for 2 decades, he found himself wondering if he had ever really belonged to anyone at all. Her father's letters were still there, yellowed with age, tucked in the drawer where she'd hidden them, the demands, the warnings, and finally the last one, the one that had broken something in her during those final weeks. I know who you are. A different hand. A different fear. She had never told him what it meant. Now he needed to know. He opened the drawer, hands unsteady, and unfolded the papers one by one. The final letter was short, a single line. "Your son is looking for you." Oliver went still. The room seemed to tilt around him. He read it again, his breath catching. Not Isaac, not Margaret. A son she had given away before he'd ever known her, a piece of her life she'd kept from him completely. A young man out there somewhere, searching for answers no one had ever given him. His hands tightened around the paper. There had been another child all along. And now she was gone, and the questions that remained had no one left to answer them. He sat with it a long time, staring at the words, at the shape of a life he realized he'd never fully known. And for the first time since her death, Oliver let himself grieve not only for her, but for the marriage he'd believed in so completely, a life he now understood had always carried a few quiet ghosts of its own. The house felt different without her, not just the silence, but the weight of everything left unsaid. For decades, Oliver had believed the love between them was solid, unshakable. Now that belief was slipping through his hands like sand. He sat at the kitchen table with the letter in front of him. "Your son is looking for you." Sarah had carried this for years and never once told him. How could she sit across the table from him every night, knowing there was another child who shared her blood, and never speak his name? She had confessed so much in those final days, the money, the doubt, the fact that she hadn't married him for love, not at first. But this, she had kept. And now it was his to carry alone. Isaac and Margaret grieved in their own way, their mother steady and constant, the center of the only world they'd known. To Oliver she had been more than that, his partner, his home, the person he'd trusted above everyone else alive. Now he wasn't certain what in their life together had been real. Was love still love, if it had started as something else entirely? He didn't know, but he needed to find out anyway. Days passed. He kept working, because the mill didn't care what he'd lost. It demanded the same sweat and hours it always had, and that, at least, was simple. Nothing else was. Not the weight of strangers' eyes at the market, not the cold half of the bed his hand still reached for out of habit, not the drawer where the letter waited, patient for him to decide what to do with it. One evening, once the children were asleep, he unfolded it again. No name. No return address. Only that single, brutal fact: a son out there, somewhere, looking for answers, and no one left alive to give them but him. He wrestled with it for weeks. What did he owe a stranger who'd never been part of their lives? What good would it even do, this far along? But then another thought came. and it wouldn't leave him alone. What if it had been Isaac? What if someone had taken his own son, erased him, turned him into a secret nobody spoke of? Wouldn't he want someone to come looking? Wouldn't his son deserve exactly that? So one morning, before the sun had fully cleared the rooftops, Oliver left the house with the letter folded in his hand and walked to the post office. And for the first time since Sarah's death, he made a decision. He would find this boy, this man now, grown, somewhere out in the world. He would give him the truth that had been taken from him before he'd even had the chance to ask for it. Even if it hurt, even if it changed everything he thought he understood about his own life. Because the past had already taken enough from all of them. Oliver wasn't going to let it take anything more. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. Share it with someone who'd love it, and tell us in the comments what you think happens next. And if you're looking for more stories like this one, we'll see you in the next.